I did it again. I have now stuck to my reading goals for 2 months in a row. It's not really something worth celebrating because who cares? But at the same time, I think I care. Do I care? Do I care? No, I don't. But I did it anyway, and it's a thing I did. But more importantly than a thing that doesn't matter is what I read in September. And what I read in September was really, really good. I had a really, really fun month reading a whole big stack of really, really good books. But before we dive in, this is a channel about books, and I generally do a really bad job of reminding people that I wrote a book and you should go buy it. Managing and Other Lies is available on Amazon pretty much everywhere. If you don't know what it's about, this is a short collection of really gross, really taboo queer horror stories. The first story is a gothic horror novella inspired by Shirley Jackson and Franz Kafka, and the other 5 stories are all different styles of horror, mostly themed around the queer and trans experience, and I'm very, very proud of it. So this spooky season, why not check out Managing and Other Lies? Now onto the stack. I'm doing this in no particular order, and at the top of the stack is this, Authority by Jeff VanderMeer. This is the second book in the Southern Reach series, what was at one time called the Southern Reach trilogy, but we are about to get a 4th one and I've got a review copy. Each of the books in the Southern Reach reads very, very differently. The first one, Annihilation, is the most popular one, and it tells the story of an expedition into a strange coastal region called Area X. Area X exists in this semi-impenetrable bubble, and when people go in, they are changed by it. They might die and never be found. They might come out riddled with disease or severe trauma, memory issues. A lot of weird things happen in Area X, and the first book, Annihilation, follows an expedition into Area X. Authority, however, is actually set in the Southern Reach itself, which exists as a government agency that monitors everything that happens to Area X. They're the people that send the expeditions in, they're the people trying to figure out what the hell Area X even is. And Authority follows a man who likes to be called Control. That's his chosen name, which is adorably on the nose ironic because he has no control over the situation at all. This is a wonderfully Kafkaesque novel, as you'll know if you watched my previous video, because the Southern Reach is a kind of circular place where answers just don't seem to exist. Control goes around trying to find out things about Area X, tries to understand this new place that he's supposed to be in charge of, and he can't get answers from anyone, and we, the reader, are desperate to understand Area X better. It is still a place of mystery to us, and Control is not the guy to trust to try and get these very vital, very important answers. He interviews people, he goes through all the files and papers and documents and video footage. He's constantly talking to the people who've been there longer than him to try to understand this place, but he just can't. It is a Kafkaesque novel about government bureaucracy, and it's also, just like the first one, a work of strange science fiction tinged with a little bit of horror, and I loved it. I won't dwell on this one too much because I did a big video on it, like a really big, long, massive review. This was my second time reading R.F. Kuang's The Poppy War. I read this book when it first came out like 5 years ago, and I thought, yeah, that was a pretty decent fantasy novel. But since then, I have fallen in love with R.F. Kuang's work. Babel and Yellowface are 2 of my favorite novels of all time. I love them so much. And so I owed The Poppy War another read. And now, I'm not joking, this is my favorite fantasy novel ever. It is perfect. I love it so, so much. I'm gonna read the second one ASAP. Maybe next month, we'll see how we go. And if you want my full thoughts, as I said, I've done a massive review this month that you can go and watch right now. Stark Holborn's 10 Low is a really, really fun, action-packed work of science fiction. I've got the entire trilogy and I'm making my way through it bit by bit. I've got like 3 trilogies on the go right now. Literally, I actually have. I've talked about all of them now. The Southern Reach, The Poppy War, and this. And 10 Low was an absolute blast to read. Comparisons to things like Dune, Mad Max, and Star Wars feel impossible to ignore because this is a work of science fiction set on a desolate desert planet. Our protagonist is a young woman with a very mysterious past, and it's set in the aftermath of a great war which spread across an entire solar system. The book is set somewhere in the future. We're not sure how far exactly. Humanity left Earth, has populated a solar system, and at some point recently there was a massive war between the main government of this solar system and a kind of rebel faction. Our protagonist, Ten Lo, was part of that rebel faction. She was sentenced to prison, and at some point she got out, she fled to a desert moon, and she works as a medic trying to help people, trying to be as good of a person as she can, but it's a difficult place to live. It is a moon full of raiders and marauders and black market traders, etc., etc. Very, very Tatooine from Star Wars. It's a tough place to survive in, but this moon is also populated by a mysterious, ghostly, psychic alien race that are completely invisible and seem to speak to Ten, get into her mind, give her directions. It's mysterious and strange, and when the book begins, she is guided towards a crash site. An escape vessel has landed in the desert, and she goes over there to see what's going on, and there's a child who has survived, but this child is not really a child. She is a genetically modified super soldier. Ten Lo rescues her, and the two of them set out on a kind of adventure together. I won't tell you any more because at some point I'll do a big video about the whole trilogy, but I had a blast reading it. I feel like I've talked about Bloom by Delilah S. Dawson quite a lot at this point. I've made TikToks and other videos about it, so my thoughts are out there. What I will say is that this is a very impressive book, especially for something so short. It's only 200 pages long, and in that time, the book moves from a cheekily seductive work of sapphic romance into something darkly gothic, Wuthering Heights-esque kind of toxic, and eventually in the second half moves into all-out terror, and eventually unhinged horror. This is a book of escalation. The sapphic romance vibes are impeccable. It is tantalizing, it is exciting, and as we go, we find ourselves shifting from excitement to trepidation to absolute fear. It is so perfectly well executed. I loved every moment I spent with it. Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White is another novel I've spoken about a lot this month. Andrew Joseph White is quickly becoming one of my favorite horror authors and one of my favorite queer authors. And this month we just got the news that Lily Wachowski is turning his first novel, Hell Followed With Us, into a film. I am so happy for him. This is so cool. And this novel, Compound Fracture, is another absolute win from him. It tells the story of a young autistic trans teen who has just come out, and he also carries the weight of his family history on his shoulders. He lives in a small, almost forgotten working class mining town. His great-grandfather was publicly executed as a socialist unionist. His family's greatest rival is the local sheriff. The sheriff's son ends up beating Miles to a pulp, and the whole novel is about cycles of violence within working class communities. It is utterly fantastic, wonderfully compelling, brilliantly political, a very, very strikingly, uncomfortably violent work of queer horror fiction, and I loved every single moment that I spent with it. I've been trying to read more audiobooks lately, and this month I read Feet of Clay in audiobook. I have nothing to say about it though, honestly. This is another great Terry Pratchett Discworld novel. I genuinely don't know what to say about this book, and now I'm kind of worried that audiobooks don't go in the same way that visual media does. I know that visual auditory learner thing, it's not really real, but I literally am struggling to remember this book now, so I'm just gonna put it down. A novel that I had so much fun with this month was Heads Will Roll by Josh Winning. In fact, I did a whole video about this book and other slasher horror novels, and that video was completely buried by YouTube because the thumbnail was covered in bloodstains, which I thought was really fun, but YouTube was like, no, that hurts our sensibilities, it's scary. So I changed the thumbnail, but it was kind of too little too late. So if you love horror fiction and you didn't watch that video, I'd really appreciate it. You can hear all about this book in detail and a bunch of other really good slasher horror novels in preparation for Halloween. Heads Will Roll is a really good summer camp slasher, very much in the vein of Friday the 13th, that kind of thing, but while it is referential, while it is self-aware, it's also very much its own thing. And as I've said before, the way that it becomes its own thing is by being about cancel culture. Our protagonist, up until recently, was a brand new Hollywood star. She was playing the lead character in a Netflix sitcom. Everybody loved her. And then she tweeted something that got her cancelled. And I mean seriously cancelled. Not everyone will forget about this in a week. No, the show was cancelled by Netflix, and now she's at a summer camp for adults trying to wean herself off her phone and internet access in general. She wants to get offline and reconnect with herself, and she meets a bunch of campers who are there for the same reason. At the beginning, she's very paranoid that she'll get recognized, and that's an interesting point that I won't dwell on, but I'll just tease that. And of course, there must be a slasher. So at the beginning of the novel, they're all sitting around a campfire and someone tells a story of a girl who was once beheaded in this area. Her head was never found, and now her ghost roams around knocking on doors, asking for her head. If you don't give her her head, which you probably won't, she will take yours. That's the setup, that's the slasher, and it all coalesces so brilliantly. This is such a fun slasher story. Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid is not very good. It bills itself as a feminist retelling, but it absolutely is not. Last week I did a video on the death of the feminist retelling. It was an essay that I originally wrote for my patrons, and then I decided to make it into a video essay, and it centered around the conversation of feminist retellings, usually within the realm of Greek mythology. And here, Ava Reid has attempted to do a feminist retelling of the story of Lady Macbeth from Shakespeare's Macbeth. But the thing is, Lady Macbeth is already a powerful feminist icon. I know everything about Macbeth. I taught it when I was a school teacher. I've seen so many play and film versions. I know half the play off by heart in my head. I have loved Lady Macbeth since I first studied the play when I was in school. She is an icon, and Ava Reid strips away every single thing that is good or interesting or strong about her in the name of not making a feminist retelling at all. This is laughably bad. You can definitely still enjoy this novel if you set aside the feminist retelling, which I know is like the entire point of the book, but it does work as a rugged and raw piece of dark, pseudo-gothic historical fiction. So depending on what angle you look at the book from, you can have a really good fun time with it. It has a lot of merits outside of the entire point of it. It's a weird thing to say, I'm kind of grasping at straws. I had a lot of fun reading it for its environment, for the decent enough writing and world building, etc, etc. There's a lot to be enjoyed. If you ignore the entire core of what it is, because the core of what it is a dreadful, awful retelling of Lady Macbeth's life that strips away all the feminism of her character. This book is the opposite of everything it's set out to do. I don't know how it's so woefully misguided, but it is. My last read of the month, I just finished this yesterday, was The Cautious Traveller's Guide to the Wastelands. This was written by Sarah Brooks, who's a pretty interesting person. She's a professor of East Asian Studies at the University of Leeds, and she runs the Leeds Center for New Chinese Writing, so she is an expert in Chinese language and culture. And this novel is a lot of things. It's a work of Gothic fiction, historical fiction, it's an adventure story, it's an alternate history specifically, it is fantastical, it is horror tinged, it's juggling a lot of balls, and it does it really artfully. It is set around 1900 on the Trans-Siberian Express, but in this alternate history, the journey from Beijing to Moscow is a very dangerous one. All of Siberia is a wasteland populated by something. You don't know at first, you don't know for the longest time what exactly the dangers outside of the train are, only that it is a very perilous journey. The train is long and expansive. There are train cars full of different things. There's a garden, there's a cafe, a restaurant, first class quarters, third class, etc. It's like a small town, and we follow 3 or 4 different protagonists on this train as they go from Beijing to Moscow. They're all there for different reasons. And as we go, we learn about them, we learn about the train, and we learn about the wasteland as they call it. This is a really, really fun, really satisfying work of dark, gothic, fantasy, alternate history, historical fiction, and I had a blast. I read quite a lot of horror and dark stuff this month because it's spooky season, and I'll be reading even more next month. But a really lovely palate cleanser that I read in September was The Honey Witch by Sydney J. Shields. This is both a work of romantasy and cozy fantasy, and it's queer. I'm so glad that it's queer because romantasy is just absolutely full to the gills with toxic straight people being awful. The Honey Witch is set in a place that doesn't exist, in a time that doesn't exist. It feels vaguely historical, but none of the places are real. It's all a little bit weird, but it gives the author the freedom to not have to be historically accurate ever at all, even for a moment. Our protagonist is a young woman called Marigold. She lives in a kind of English county. Her family want her to marry a man and settle down and be a good little wife, but she doesn't want to do that, and lucky for her, her grandmother is a witch. Her mother passed on the responsibility to inherit the witchhood, but Marigold wants to, and when her grandmother shows up, she says, "Yes please, I'll become the next honey witch." And so her grandmother whisks her off to an island on a lake, and there her grandmother, as she's getting old and frail and dying, teaches Marigold the ways of the titular honey witch. This witch has specific responsibilities, she nurtures her community, and as you go you just learn about her role and her life, and soon enough she meets a young woman who doesn't believe in magic. The two of them awkwardly spend time together because they have a third friend in common, and the 3 of them become a little trio, but these 2 are not getting along, and you know eventually not only will they get along, but they will fall in love. All of that is given away in the blurb. This is a sapphic work of cozy, romantic fantasy. It doesn't go as far as being an enemies to lovers story, it's just 2 people who don't get along at first, and eventually they will. They'll overcome their differences. And that's good because enemies to lovers, again, is a very tired trope. This feels like a more grounded version of that. Something a lot more believable and realistic. I enjoyed the romance and I really enjoyed the cozy vibes. This is a very, very charming book. Now, I actually read 2 manga this month, but I didn't enjoy either of them, so I'm just not going to talk about them. And finally, I also read 3 Batman comics this month. I am fully back on my Batman train. I'm reading a lot of comic books. I love Batman to pieces, and I had mixed experiences here. In case you don't know and you're interested, the way that Batman is published every single month is that there are usually 2 Batman comics. There is Batman, the main title that comes out once a month, and there's also Detective Comics, which is what DC in DC Comics stands for. Detective Comics is a side story that goes along with Batman. Everything in it is canon, and somehow you just have to ignore the fact that Batman might be in 2 very different places at the same time in 2 different comics. You just go with it. And this is the start of a new, very gothic story arc by an author called Ram V. I have never read their works before. I hear good things, but I did not enjoy their approach to Batman in Detective Comics. Their style is very literary, but without any substance to it. They write in this almost surrealist literary way that kind of reminds me of the writing of Grant Morrison, but without any substance and without anything actually interesting and thought-provoking happening. This is kind of an empty thing. On the surface, it looks and sounds kind of compelling, but ultimately the story is very lackluster. The dialogue again, is written in this really literary way, but it doesn't actually match Batman at all. It feels pretentious. That's the word for it. This is a very pretentious Batman comic, and I did not get along with it. It is drawn by Raphael Albuquerque, whose art is always fantastic, and so I did have fun looking at it. And I also read volumes 2 and 3 of the current main Batman comic that's going on. This main story is being written by Chip Zdarsky, who is an amazing artist and an even better writer, honestly. I loved volume 1 of his Batman so much. I kind of hoped that he would write Batman forever. And volume 2 is just as good as volume 1. Batman has been zapped off to an alternate universe where Bruce Wayne died and Batman never existed, and he has to kind of fix that Gotham, or at least do his best to figure out how to manage it and also find his way home. It is a multiverse story to end all multiverse stories. It is so much fun. Honestly, the way that Chip Zdarsky pays homage to the history and legacy of Batman in all different forms of media, comics, cartoons, films, and beyond, it is masterful. It's brilliant fan service, but also legitimately a brilliantly well-written story. But then he followed it up with a Joker origin story, and I didn't really enjoy this at all. It serves no purpose whatsoever. I spent several issues reading as I learned more about the first year of Joker's life as the Joker, and I did not care. We did not need this. There is no reason for this thing to exist at all. I'm hoping now that he's done with this, he'll go back to focusing on what Batman's up to right now and we can have a good time with it, but Joker Year 1 doesn't need to exist at all. There you go, that's everything I read in September. Once again, you can pick up a copy of my book. It is spooky season, time to read some queer horror. Yes, good, excellent, well done. I love this thing, and I love you too. Subscribe for books.